Good afternoon. Welcome to Trends in Online Gaming. Today we'll be talking about the intersection of transmedia and free play. Before I introduce our panelists, let me introduce myself. My name is Chris Elliott. I'm Executive Creative Director for Wonderman and also Chief Creative on the Xbox account. So for our panelists, I'm probably marketing for something of a dinosaur from their point of view. So we have today two distinguished panelists, James Hursthouse, CEO of Roadhouse Interactive, and Mark Long, CEO of Meteor Entertainment. And James is going to bring you through a little bit of an overview of the free-to-play space. And then Mark is going to take you through some of the trends and strategies he's seeing in transmedia these days. We'll go through their presentations. They each have about a 5 to 10 minute presentation. And then after that, I have some questions for them. And then we'll leave some time a little bit at the end to open up to the questions from the floor. So without further as it off to James, who's going to take you through what he is seeing in the free-to-play space these days.
Okay, thanks, Chris. So as Chris said, we're really, I think, on this panel, looking at this intersection between free-to-play on the one hand and transmedia. And so what we thought we'd do is lead off with a quick overview of what free-to-play is. In some ways it could be a refresher for some of you. I apologize if it's a little bit 101. But I did want to just go back and say, okay, what is free-to-play? Where did it come from? And then Mark's going to go on and talk a little bit more about sort of trends in transmedia. So first of all, a little bit of background about Roadhouse and myself. I've been in the industry since about 2001. I was actually based in Japan for about 15 years. And so my introduction to the games industry came through working with a very early incarnation of Nexon in Japan. So Nexon, as you may know, recently went public. It's probably one of the leading online game companies in the world. And for me, at least, that was really my introduction to free-to-play as far back as kind of 2003, 2004. Roadhouse came together at the end of 2009, myself and two co-founders. And both of my co-founders were veterans of the Vancouver games industry scene. So, very well-experienced PC game developers, console game developers. And we met sort of back in 2004, 2005. And ever since then, we're threatening to work together and trying to blend this idea of the Asian free-to-play business model with the depth of the Western game design, game production processes that they could bring to the table. So we got together at the end of 2009. And since then, we've really been focusing on a couple of titles, which I'll talk to you about in a couple of slides. But first of all, a little bit about the market environment and sort of why we put Roadhouse together when we did. So as you can see from this slide, this comes from the Cloud Gaming Report back in 2012, a few months ago. And this is a breakdown of the global online games market growth that we can sort of expect to see between now and 2017. So you can see a huge amount of growth. I think what's interesting on this slide, though, is that the idea that MMO, MMOG, and some of the sort of more hardcore game types actually remain quite dominant on this slide. And I think, as an industry, we're sort of seeing that the idea of building games for gamers is still something that we want to focus on, right? I think there's been this sort of two-year love affair with the idea that everybody and their brother and mother and dog, cat would play games. But I think, there's been a realization recently that really the best thing you can do is make games for gamers, because gamers are the guys that tend to spend a lot of money on this hobby. So anyway, that's one thing that we've noticed. The other thing for us, I think, is this idea that if you think about sort of back to the sort of late 40s, early 50s, content and brand and, sponsors, basically the people who are willing to pay for the content to be developed, were willing to do so because they needed to reach an audience, right? So if you think about, the earliest days of television, here you can see the actually it was the Buick-Burl TV hour. So Buick actually got a higher billing in this case than Milton Berle. And that's the Texaco Star Theater. So a lot of what we think that we're doing right now, we seem to be doing, is trying to find a new way for content owners, for brand owners, for sponsors to reach an audience that no longer watches television. And so for me, this growth here in the space is really driven by the fact that the audience that would have previously been exposed to messages through television is simply either not watching television, or if they are watching television, like me, probably for the last, I don't know, however long it is since I bought my iPad, I watch Netflix. I don't think I've seen a television advert for, I don't know, 18 months, 24 months probably. Obviously, that's an exaggeration, but in reality, I'm a sort of new breed of consumer to whom it's very hard to actually reach with a traditional advert. So, for us, as I said, the first gig that we started to work on was Family Guy Online. This was actually directly funded by Fox, and I can't really applaud Fox more highly than for the fact that they took this risk to self-fund an extension of Family Guy as obviously a very iconic TV brand into the interactive space. So, for example, we've been working very closely with Seth MacFarlane's production company. We have writers from the show who are writing for us on the game. We have new voice. And so really it's, an early example, I think, of a true transmedia extension. And as a result of that, there's a lot of benefits there. Obviously, Family Guy as a TV brand kind of lends itself well to advertising and sponsorships, and that's some of the success we've had with the game so far has primarily been in attracting sponsors and advertisers, and I think we've managed to bring those sponsored products and work with those advertising partners in a sensitive way that doesn't alienate the audience. Second game we're working on, similar in some ways to what Mark's up to, is all about big robots. This is MechWarrior Tactics, which is a real-time strategy version, strategy iteration of the MechWarrior IP. Again, taking a sort of classic IP, classic brand, this time from the game space and pushing it into the free-to-play space. We also do have some interest in Transmedia company, so working with a group down in Los Angeles that are developing a slate of 5 or 6 properties which have been designed from day one to be transmedia. So in some cases, full-scale movies, in some cases animated television series. So again, there's some similarities between the direction that we're pushing the companies here. So as I said, a quick refresher. So what is free-to-play? Emerged in Asia in around 2003. So for me, really the only transition in the industry that I've lived through was the transition from online subscription to online free-to-play. And primarily, the transition happened because people, despite the fact that the games were on servers, still ended up becoming victims of piracy, right? So the idea was, okay, well, how do I get around this idea that people are going to rip off my game, even if it is on a server side, and manage to play for free, even though they should be paying a subscription? And the answer actually was, well, let's just embrace this idea that people are going to copy the client, hand it out to each other, but then put things into the game where people would need to buy items or virtual currency in order to progress through the experience. So since then, the idea really is that the game has to, for me at least, the game has to remain primarily free throughout. The idea of a try before you buy or a 30-day trial or a paywall or whatever, it really doesn't qualify in our book as free to play. I think the idea is that the experience should be available for free for users who really are willing to sit there and grind their way through the game for a long time. So really, one of the big benefits is, probably the biggest benefit, is that it attracts the widest possible audience because there's no barrier to entry. And again, I apologize if this is a little bit rudimentary, but basically the difference between having to go down to Electronics Boutique or GameStop and pay $60 in order to try this experience for us is just no longer a relevant part of the entertainment industry of 2012 moving forward. So, how big's free to play? So, some data, again, it depends on who you listen to, but in this particular case, the free to play outgrew subscription revenue in the US sort of mid-2010, and the curve there continues obviously in the right direction. And obviously there's been a bunch of examples of games that have come out. Star Wars Old Republic, probably the most well-known example of the last 12 months, where the game came out, it was initially launched as a subscription product, but very quickly had to transition to free-to-play. For example, even in casual games like with Bejeweled Blitz, some of you may have seen some of PopCap's presentations that talk about that transition from Bejeweled to Bejeweled Blitz and how much more successful Bejeweled Blitz has been than the pay-to-download version. So, some of the data I've seen was that there was 9 times the number of downloads, resulting in about 5 times the amount of revenue for Bejeweled Blitz compared with, say, Bejeweled. So how big? One of the leading titles in the genre right now, League of Legends. A little bit of data from the Riot Games there. I think the really interesting statistic there is 12 million daily active players. Obviously 70 million accounts. And again, primarily I believe this is because the game is fundamentally free to play, no barrier to entry. And obviously it's not just hardcore games as well. Despite being somewhat, in its getting long in the tooth now, Farmville still has about 18.2 million monthly active users, which is a very, very sizable audience. So this slide here comes from Contagion, very good online marketing company. And really this is, I think, summarizes what the business side of the free-to-play industry is all about. So first of all, driving users down the top of the funnel, through viral sources. So the players that you currently have, how do we encourage them to put out their, to encourage their friends to come and play? And then also non-viral sources, which has traditionally been paid banner ads or paying to get users to come and play your game. So recently, the cost of that user install is really one of the key pieces that we're having to deal with. Some of the companies that are coming in with long-term publisher strategies are willing to pay as much as $4, $5, $6, even $7 for each user that they need to attract to the game. And obviously, as smaller companies, that then becomes challenging. So, I think Mark's going to go on and talk a little bit about, what are some of the other strategies we can use to drive the users down that funnel. And then obviously, how long do they stick around? How long can we retain them for? And then ultimately, how can we monetize them? So obviously, the engagement loop now, as game designers, has to include this call to buy. So the call to action really includes buy. How do we do that? Obviously, a bunch of different items. There's just a few examples there from Family Guy. So we have decorative items. We have items that increase the rate at which you earn XP. And basically, the systems within the game are encouraging users to want to buy these items for a number of different reasons. Obviously, there's a way that you convert real money into virtual currency. So traditionally, that's been just an exchange either with a credit card or whatever. But again, over the last few years, we've seen the emergence of alternative monetization. So here, for example, if you sign up for Netflix, then we'll give you, 51 reward points or whatever game this was from. I can't actually remember. So as I mentioned, Family Guy's been interesting because, there's been a lot of opportunities there for us to do advertising integration. So I just wanted to throw this up as an example of a successful one that we did. This was with Unilever for this Choco Taco, which is a chocolate-flavored ice cream taco. And this mechanical bull that we put into the Drunken Clam in Virtual Quahog, was written at least, last time we looked, it was at least 250,000 times. Average engagement about 40 seconds. And so in that case, it's a different kind of relationship with the sponsor. And again, for me, that sort of harkens back to the Texaco TV hour that I was showing you earlier. So finally, it's not just games. I think there's a lot of momentum now to say, okay, what do we know from free-to-play game design? How can we attract the widest possible audience into a product or an interactive service? How do we then enable each user to engage and pay for that thing at the level that they're happy with? So, at Roadhouse, we're looking at education, healthcare, and some, what you might term serious game projects, where we apply what we know from the free-to-play space and apply it in different areas of society. So again, as I said, I'm just going to put that slide up again before I hand off to Mark, because as I said, I think really one of the key elements of success here is how effectively can you drive users into your product, how successfully and how effectively can you retain them, and then how successfully can you monetize them. So as I said, traditionally that's been a question of either paying for or encouraging existing users to spread the word around your game to their other users. But as I think Mark's going to talk about, there's an emerging trend in transmedia that we think can help drive users to these free-to-play interactive experiences. So I'd like to hand it over to Mark. And
just 1 second, please. I've lost my cursor. Hi, I'm Mark Long, CEO, Meteor Entertainment. We're a Seattle-based publisher. Meteor's publishing a AAA title, Hawken, this December. How many of you guys have heard of Hawken? It's pretty amazing to me that this thing has gotten so much love. I'm just like you. I saw Hawken in April of 2011 in the YouTube video. It just blew my mind. I've never seen anything like it. And King Lee and the young and very small independent team in Pasadena managed to synthesize everything I love about the sci-fi genre, mechs, movies like Blade Runner, into a single game. Hawken originally was going to be an XBLA title. When they put the video up, this team of 9 developers didn't expect to get all the interest that they got. And they were chased by virtually every publisher in North America. Mitch Lasky, venture capitalist at Benchmark Capital, saw the video too, or actually his brother told him, you've got to find these guys. It's the most amazing game he'd seen in a long time. And Mitch chased them down and convinced them to make the title free to play, which was a huge leap forward in their thinking, being this independent developer, not understanding monetization. They were really afraid to get involved in such a radical change, but we were able to convince them when they saw the success of Riot and League of Legends. Now, free-to-play in 2012 represents the opportunity to reach completely upstream to the consumer without any intermediary. We've seen this time and time again in the internet, where we have the unbundling of content directly to consumer. And if you think about it, console video games are the last piece of entertainment that you actually get in your car, or drive to a store and buy, right? We're ripe for disruption. And we will ship to all of those territories on 12/12/12 when we launch Hawken. Now, unfortunately, that same time period, we're up against these 2 major franchises. They're so popular that literally everybody stops playing everything they're playing, stops watching TV. You can see all kinds of metrics every time a new Call of Duty title comes out. So we had this huge problem, like how to create awareness of the game. There was substantial awareness already, but we needed even broader awareness to be successful. We needed awareness all over the world, and we needed to be able to drive consumers to our website. So I brought in a strategy of using inbound marketing or transmedia marketing. I did this because I just don't believe in advertising anymore, as you said. When was the last time you watched an ad? Like, we do everything we can now with paid media to avoid advertising. I believe that web advertising is just a waste of money. As soon as your money's gone, your ad campaign's gone, your customers are gone. And we're in the business of constantly acquiring new customers, reacquiring our old customers. So I had the idea that we would use a transmedia strategy. Well, what is transmedia? I think the best example of a well-executed transmedia campaign was The Matrix. We had this story distributed over 3 feature films, a DVD that had 10 anime short films on it, and 2 video games and comic books, graphic novels, prose novels. What was really cool about The Matrix, though, was that the story was distributed across the various platforms. You didn't do what we call platforming in the industry, and that means taking the intellectual property and just recreating that world and characters on a new media. Instead, you were telling radically disparate parts of the story in the media that was most appropriate. So one of the things that, if you love The Matrix, that you might have seen is in the Animatrix, one of the shorts involves two characters trying to warn Morpheus that the machines are drilling to Zion, and they're trying to get a letter into a mailbox. At the end of that short, the letter gets into the mailbox, and the game, a year later, when the second Matrix came out, they also released the first video game. And in the game, you play Ghost and Niobe, and they're trying to get the letter out of the postal system and to Morpheus. And then in the feature film, there's this great, very small scene where Ghost hands a letter to Morpheus, and he says, the machines are coming to Zion. So each one of those pieces stood completely alone and was a lot of fun, but when you put them all together, you get what Danny Bilson calls additive comprehension. It's just cool. You go, oh, wow, that's so fucking cool. Like, all those pieces were together, and because I love this world and I want to immerse myself in it, I was able to experience that connection. There is no single source for the intellectual property. You can't find one thing that you can buy to get it all together, and that speaks to the young consumer's need to be information hunter-gatherers. Our audience exists primarily on YouTube and console game platforms and PCs, playing games on PCs as well. And so they're first hearing about games through game trailers and reviews like on Machinima, and they're interested once they hear about that in finding out more information. So they're very active in this way. So we took our marketing budget and applied it to the production of these pieces of media. All these pieces of media are in production now. One of the things I've learned about producing films in Hollywood is the person with the most power is not a gross producer or the studio, it's the one who's writing the check. So if you finance the screenplay, attach a director and maybe an actor, and go to the studio, you've done something they call packaging, and you've basically done a lot of the heavy lifting that is called development, or sometimes development hell, right? So instead of just saying, hey, look at our Hawken video gameplay, why don't you option it for $1 million, and then good luck with that. We've been active partners with all the producers across this media. So the comic will come out first, the graphic novel. We have a web series in production with Joel Silver and Warner Brothers, and that happened because we financed a prototype of the way the series might look like, and I'm going to show it to you in a second. This is, by the way, how Tron got greenlit. Digital Domain put about $500,000 into this early proof of concept that had Jeff Bridges in it, if you remember seeing that. They showed it at Comic-Con, and Disney closed the deal within a month afterwards. So we decided we would do the same thing. And that allows us to get all these pieces into production. So they went into production this past year, but they don't actually start releasing until next year. And then we believe we'll achieve this funnel drawing that we saw here a second ago, where all the digital media is cross-linked and search optimized with embedded analytics, so we can study how things, how players progress through the media to a single call of action, which is playhawken.com, where that's all you need to know. Once you get there, because the game is free, we hope the acquisition and onboarding is frictionless. Do we have audio?
Everyone looks to the past as the golden times, a place to return to in their dreams. But while the rest of the world looks to the corporations for guidance, the real warriors fight for the soul of the planet. Pilots who believe the way to redemption is forward, down a path of pain and sacrifice. A well-oiled axe and a steady hand will change the tide.
So that was our teaser trailer released at E3 last year, and that was the proof of concept that Warner Brothers saw and picked up the title. The production was really interesting. It was very grassroots guerrilla because that was shot in downtown LA in an alley over one weekend, and the mechs were assets actually out of the video game that we inserted in post. And the production values that you see were achieved primarily by Jerry O'Flaherty and Digital Domain. Jerry art-directed Gears of War, and it arguably is the best Unreal cinematic director in the world, and this is kind of what he specializes in doing in Hollywood, is merging game engine technology with feature film. So it's our hope in the feature to use the game engine again, this time for the majority of the special effects, not just majority of practical effects that you saw here. Thank you.
Definitely good stuff. Super cool. So we do have I have some questions that I wanted to go over with our panelists, and then after that we'll open up. We'll have about 20 minutes left. We'll open up some questions from the floor. When that happens, it'd be lovely if you guys could use the microphone so everybody can hear. If you don't, we'll just go ahead and repeat the questions. But starting out, we've looked at a couple of different examples of free-to-play and some different monetization strategies with each of your offerings. How are different genres of games monetizing differently in free-to-play? Beyond what you've shown here, what are some other strategies that are being used to monetize the free-to-play space?
Well, I think you can find free-to-play primarily today on your mobile phone. We've all watched how the first games in the App Store came out at $3.99, then $2.99, eventually $99, and now the majority are free. And certainly the highest monetizing titles are free. We also see on Facebook with Zynga titles, the majority of those are free to play as well. But in those two categories, casual and mobile, monetization numbers are really small. Like they're pennies to a player per month, a figure we call ARPU, average revenue per paying user. In casual, they're single-digit dollars in mobile, but in core free-to-play, they're in the tens of dollars. League of Legends, approximately 25 to 35% of players worldwide spend $25 to $100 a month on the title. And they're primarily just buying new champion characters.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely there's different genres, as Mark said, lend themselves to different kinds of monetization patterns. And again, that kind of goes back to what I was saying about this re-emphasis of building games for gamers, because again, the data shows that, the other data that I have sort of right now, we're working on a couple of collectible card games, because collectible card games, there was a white paper that came out recently. I can't remember who it came out from. Anybody's interested, send me an email and I'll forward it to you. But where I said basically, collectible cards, just things like Rage of Bahamut and some of those games are monetizing around $35 to $55 per month for the users that get into that. And again, I think it's because there's the collectible nature is very sort of, in line with this idea of wanting to spend money to make sure that you have all of the cards and the different kind of capabilities that you have in the game. Whereas, with something like Family Guy, it's much broader. I think it has a wider appeal. But, again, it's harder to really get users to want to part with a lot of money. So, again, I think that's why we're sort of veering more towards this idea of working in conjunction with sponsorship much more than we would do with something, say, like, MechWarrior, where the idea of Axe body spray and the mechs doesn't really kind of gel all that well. You know what I mean?
So that brings up a good question. I mean, if we are starting to see trends in the monetization of free-to-play, if we're starting to see strategies that are successful, that more and more people are going to pick up, and I think we've seen some of those strategies already, do you think that there is a chance for free-to-play fatigue? I mean, as people are asked again, perhaps in some of these models, to pay. And as a follow-up question to that, do you think that those strategies are stable, or do you think that they need to change over time to be more relevant to the audience as they grow more used to them?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there is, well, from a personal experience, I think there is some fatigue. I'll give you a really personal example. My son ended up spending $800 on Dragon Veil. eggs, right? And he's 7. And it was actually because, Apple has this 2 strikes you're out rule, and he'd unfortunately done it before with some kind of fish tank thing where he'd spent $40. So, my wife calls me, and I was at some networking thing in San Francisco, and she said, we got a problem because, Tomo's spent $800 on Dragon Veil right now. For me, there was a couple of things that really then came into play with what we're trying to do at Roadhouse. The first one was, I definitely don't want to be creating games where we are trying to kind of pull the wool over people's eyes as to whether they're spending real or fake money, virtual money or real money. And I think there are some games out there where, it's almost, they obfuscate the path through to actually spending real money. Now, obviously, my son's 7, so I believe he didn't really know what he was doing. But again, I don't want to be in an industry where we end up always having to say, oh, sorry, we kind of tricked you into paying. So that's one thing. And then the second thing is, I do think that there's a few games out there now where it's just constantly saying buy, invite your friends, invite your friends. And, I really think as an industry we have to move away from that. Otherwise, the sort of sanctity of the game experience is going to get diluted through that.
Yeah, I think we're in real danger of nickeling and diming our customers to death. The big question we get asked in the core market segment is this pay to play or pay to win? In other words, can I buy a mech that on day one that would take me months to grind up to and be able to beat every player as a result? It's a very tricky element of design, and I think one of the reasons why you have to design with monetization as a core design pillar from the very beginning. Otherwise, you can do one of two things. You can paint yourself into a corner, which is never run out of things to sell to your customer. And 2, that it is a very fine line you're walking with enabling a player maybe like me who wants to get in and enjoy hawking, but I'm not going to be playing during the rest of the week, and maybe I'll only play 1 weekend a month. So I'd like to buy time with my money to achieve a mech, but only level up to a certain point. And this is an emerging area in game design that we're going to see a large amount of growth in, I think.
Where do you think the mind of the free-to-play user is right now? I mean, when they see a Choco Taco there, do you think they're giving you a pass because they know somebody has to pay for it, or as long as we're not paying for advantage, do you think that that they're trending towards acceptance of those sort of strategies?
Well, I think in the case of the Choco Taco, it was interesting because there was definitely this brand, sort of a brand halo, I guess, where I think our audience felt that the advertising or the partner or the sponsor had given them something of use to use in the game. So in a way, in that particular example, I don't think there was that much backlash. I mean, there was obviously some comments about, oh, this is, you can't go anywhere without falling over a sponsored message. But in some cases, as you said, I think it's just the reality that if people want to play these kinds of entertainment, we have to fund them somehow, right? Whereas I think, something more like Hawken, the idea will be that the users will value that entertainment experience enough to actually then want to pay for that, right? So the difference with the free-to-play model is that we're not forcing somebody to pay money and then only to sort of in a sense regret having done so. It's that people get into the experience, and then at a certain point they say, I like this well enough to really want to invest. So not only, as Mark said, it's a question of whether or not you want to invest time or whether or not you want to invest money. And I think if the sponsor or the advertising partner is viewed as having that, basically replacing the requirement for the user to have to spend money, then I don't think that there's that much of a backlash. But again, how do you make that compatible with the fiction is also a challenge that we're going to have to address, right?
I don't think you can overstate the importance of the model. We like to say you can't compete with free. Earlier when we were talking, I reminded you of America's Army. It was the first free Unreal game, right? And it was arguably a horrible game, really tedious to play. But it had 12 million active players by the end of the first year, primarily because the production values were really high. Nobody'd seen anything like that for free. You certainly couldn't get an Unreal game for free. I believe free-to-play is going to be the MP3 of the game industry. Everything behind it will be destroyed, and a new business model is going to emerge from it.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, if you take that a little bit further, I think that's an interesting point, because if you think about what MP3 did in a way to music, now the music industry primarily makes its money from T-shirt sales, tours, live support, other examples or other iterations of that intellectual property, I guess, in a sense, which is sort of where you're moving with. I mean, so with Hawken, for example, do you envisage theatrical release at some point in the future if the IP's grown? And so the idea of, people then having to go and buy a movie ticket at $20 because they want to engage further with this, or $15 because they want to engage further with the IP, or, I mean, what's the strategy around the linear content?
That's certainly our hope. And I should add that the revenue that we might receive, even from a hugely successful theatrical film, will be dwarfed by the revenue that we get from the free-to-play model. So we actually don't look at any of the transmedia as a revenue stream. Instead, it's simply a marketing strategy.
But I guess Warner Brothers doesn't view it that way, right? I mean, they want to make money off the theatrical.
Right, and we're, their dream customer, right, or their dream client. Because if we're as successful, or even a fraction of success of League of Legends, and we're bringing tens of millions of customers to a theatrical film. Well, one of the reasons you see these very derivative spectacle features based on intellectual property like Battleship, which is a terrible idea for a movie, is it has what they call in Hollywood pre-awareness. The majority of money going into a film today is not actually the production, it's the marketing. And marketing has two phases, awareness and the intent phase. The intent is when you see the trailer, the last 6 weeks ramp up where you keep seeing it on television, it drives you into the theater. But the year to 9 months prior is all awareness. Well, if they can eliminate the awareness phase of the campaign, Battleship, I know what that is, then they've saved a lot of money. But they've effectively scraped the bottom of the barrel when you're trying to make movies out of things like a Hasbro toy, I think.
Right, as long as they don't spoil the idea of that genre of IP by putting out a relatively lousy movie with Liam Neeson just attached to it, right?
Yeah. And game features it's hard to point at more than 3 or 4 that you enjoy. Like, well, it's hard to do. So a lot of this transmedia production is not really being overly ambitious about what we want to do. It's being a consumer of our own media and saying, if they had just done this right from the very beginning and thought about how all this would fit, it could have been actually cool, right?
Yeah, and also enhance the story. I'm sorry, go ahead, please.
No, I was going to say, because the idea that free to play and also just social networking in general kind of is a really good crap filter, because I remember talking to people, you go and have that first weekend of the movies where the movie actually does suck, and then immediately people are on Twitter, and so there's really nowhere to escape anymore. I think in some ways the idea of being able to get away with this idea that people would spend $50 on a game, or they'd go and spend $15 on a movie because they hadn't, in a sense, the awareness wasn't there at some point in the past. And I think we're living in an age beyond that now, where immediately people know what it's like. And sometimes, as I mentioned in a couple of slides, we're looking at how do we take some of the free-to-play business models and apply it in a good way to things like healthcare or education. But sometimes we kind of riff on this idea of other industries and say, well, what would they be like if they were free to play? And the movie industry is an interesting one, because if you imagine the idea that there were no movie tickets, there was no price to entry, what would it do to attendance at theaters, right? People would just go and see what they want. And maybe you have to pay $15 to see the end, which is not quite free to play, but nonetheless it's sort of close to that. And I think it's an interesting idea. How would you support movies if everything actually was free to see and you had to support it through other ancillary or upgraded service like Meet the Cast or all these kinds of things? It's an interesting thing to think about, and sometimes
I can think of some movies I would pay extra money to get to the end quicker. But
well, yeah, exactly. Maybe there's the model. Tell me what happens.
I did have a couple more questions, but we're down to about 10 minutes, and so I'd like to open up the questions to the audience. And if you have a question, just go ahead and step up to the mic and fire away.
Hi, I'd like to address some of the concerns about free-to-play, because although a lot of companies like League of Legends or Turbine have made huge amounts of money with free-to-play, there are also companies who produce things like Outlanders that had like 2 million users in the first month and made $40,000, which was not at all enough to support any kind of living or budget that they were working on. So I wonder, what are some of the challenges with creating free-to-play? And when you need to start working on monetization, and when is free-to-play not an option for the kind of game you want to make?
It's a great question. I think it's not an option primarily in narrative-driven single-player campaign designs. I think there'll always be console versions. You know, maybe the console is now the theatrical equivalent, and free-to-play is the television or miniseries. This is an emerging space. You know, as designers, we kind of work in secret for 2 to 3 years, don't really show anybody what we're working on, and rely on our own expertise and experience. It's the opposite with free-to-play. You kind of launch with a minimum viable feature set, and then the community tells you what it is you want. It's more gaming as a service than gaming as a product. I would say we're just emerging now and primarily looking at other services for promotions, bundling, merchandising. These are all issues solved in lots of other media, but this is brand new to gaming.
What level, I mean, with that in mind, what level of adaptation do you think that a free-to-play model or a company such as either of yours needs to take once you've released something to the reactions of the fans and the audience?
Well, it's a real danger. You know, you on the one hand have to listen to the community, but you know, if we listen to the community of car drivers, for example, then there would be no seat belts or catalytic converters or, you know, even windshield wipers, because they were all stuff you don't really need, right? You can't let your community drive design too much, but this is a mechanism, again, that's evolving and bringing together brand new disciplines in game publishing and game development studios.
Yeah, no, I think, you know, it's interesting. I think we, particularly working with Fox on a high-profile title like Family Guy, you know, we did experience some of that tension around the incompatibility of a brand like that with the actual requirements of developing a game, you know, so that, you know, as early as possible. For example, you would go out and typically you would want to go out and do stress testing of servers. You'd want to have maybe 100,000 Peter Griffins running around in the world in order to sort of check that things were working, that systems, you know, retention was there very early. But then, you know, how can you do that with a very high-profile brand with enough people so that you can, you know, so I mean, certainly building that kind of online free-to-play game with an iconic IP is not without its challenges. And I think, you know, over time, as each industry starts to understand the other, I think it'll become easier there. But I think really the answer is, for us, it's just retention, really. I mean, if you can retain, I mean, obviously acquisition is important, but acquiring and then just having users flitter away is also something, I think, where the transmedia strategy and the idea of this well-rounded story that you're into because you've seen one side of the story through the comic book, you want to find out more. I think that's one piece of this, you know, quest to retain users because they feel invested in what you're trying to do, right? And so to have 2 million users come in and then immediately go away, you know, there's something fundamentally wrong with the game compulsion loop there on the one hand, and then potentially you would say, well, was the IP really strong enough to want to keep them there, right? So for us, it's just, what can we do to retain? And every day looking at analytics saying, you know, 1-day retention, 5-day retention, 30-day retention, right? So.
I had a question about the differences sort of between casual and core gamers, right? In casual free-to-play games, they tend to ask you to pay like $1 for a costume or whatever. In core games, there's some of that, but then there's some of it like buy this character, which is a much larger investment. Do you sort of see core games as asking for more money per transaction for a bigger reward, or moving towards something like episodic content and then maybe making that available for something like a single-player game?
I think there's a kind of an immutable math relative to the value of entertainment and time. So if you just took away the genre categories and said instead, you know, how much fun did I have over time, and would I be willing to pay X for that? So casual exists on the shorter end of the spectrum. You know, what we originally were calling short form gaming became casual. And then core is deeper engagement. and I think generally represents players who that's a large hobby of theirs more than anything else they're doing. So they're willing to pay more, but they're also getting more.
And then just a quick follow-up. So you see things like DLC on console, and it's obviously not free to pay because you're buying a $60 game to go with it. Do you see free-to-play moving to consoles anytime soon, or do you think this is mostly a PC and mobile gaming sort of phenomenon or realm for the future?
Certainly, it's going to emerge on console. The gatekeepers, Sony, Nintendo, and Microsoft have to keep a close eye on it, though, because the majority of their revenue comes from third-party titles that pay a royalty to Microsoft and Sony, right, for the right to publish on that platform. So they don't want to cannibalize that. So they'll probably gate it initially, and then I suspect that the next generation of consoles are launched, you'll see them open up completely. Well, I guess Sony's already wide open, but Microsoft opening up the 360 is a way of extending its life cycle.
Yeah, I mean, there were some rumors, and I think they turned out to be only rumors, that PS4, for example, was going to be discless, for example. I mean, that was something that was flying around, and the idea of having to drive to the store in order to buy a plastic disc, which then moved, again, how that would have affected the business model. Would it have been a pay-to-download model? Obviously with the acquisition of Gaikai, for example, there's questions that are, and again, this is all speculation. I really don't know anything sort of behind the Sony curtain, but I thought that was an interesting announcement that it was going to be a kind of set-top box, very powerful set-top box onto which you could download game content. It seemed to be an interesting move, and as a result of that, you would say, well, again, we want to reach the widest possible audience. And so, could they have moved to the idea where you bought a PS4 on a 3-year subscription and you're paying like it's a mobile phone, and so all these sorts of different models are going to emerge. And I think as a result of that, consoles inevitably will have to follow trends on mobile and trends on PC, because really, what is the Xbox underneath the TV if it isn't just a PC now attached to your TV that doesn't have a keyboard, right? I don't know. I start to wonder what the difference between, an iPad and a previous generation handheld game machine is anymore. Is there really a difference?
I just had a question for Mark about your concerns of Halo and Call of Duty. It looks like you're comparing Hawken to non-free-to-play games, which non-free-to-play games do have an extended play life, I guess, but not nearly as long as, say, something like Team Fortress 2. You also have some new free-to-play games, first-person shooter genre, Dust 514 and PlanetSide 2 coming out. I was just wondering why you didn't mention those as a concern. Actually, I haven't heard of that one.
Well, those are the big elephants in the room, I guess. That's our concern. If you think about launching this December, what would you be concerned about? These titles every year that they've annualized this franchise, they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So what I was doing there is acknowledging that we are in competition with them, and it was meant to introduce the idea of we can't compete with a $40 million plus ad campaign. So what can we do? What kind of jujitsu can we do? And that's what our transmedia strategy came from. And these other titles that you mentioned, it's surprising to me, I think, that we expected to see more core free-to-play announced by now. So it kind of begs the question, well, why isn't there more core to free-to-play? If you see how profitable League of Legends is, why isn't EA, Activision, the others getting into it? The answer is, if you look at their lineup, they are caught in a rock and a hard place right now. Still, the vast majority of their money comes from console. There is a brand new market to them that requires expertise that they currently just don't possess, best practices don't possess.
Yeah, I mean, it's basically Wall Street won't give them that 1 year off that they would need to retool. As far as I can tell, it's really.
And if you're Bobby Kotick, you only swing for the fence. So if they're going to go free to play, it has to be a title that they're sure they're going to dominate the world market in. That's a very high bar. So I believe that's why we haven't seen more competition, but I think it's only a matter of time.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Fabian Amati of Social Growth Technologies. What kind of shift do you expect to see from, say, TV advertising dollars going into in-game advertising dollars over the next, say, 2 to 5 years?
You have an expert sitting right in front of you who was at Activision and did in-game advertising, and maybe you could stand up. This is Paul Acunio.
Product placement or brand dollars that go from TV or...
Hey, how's it going? We have not seen a huge shift, regardless of the fact that the eyeballs have moved. I'm sure there's agency folks here, and you guys are all awesome. But it seems to me that the agencies make the majority of their money selling advertising through TV, and so it's very hard to move the needle among decision makers on the agency side and on the brand side. So we still get these in-game advertising buys really from like emerging technology budgets or innovation budgets, and clearly we've moved beyond those budgets. I think it's going to take significantly more time. I also think that you'll see a lot of the money move into gaming when gaming moves closer to TV, and people like Warner Brothers have a vested interest in having their advertising in both arenas, is my opinion.
You know, I think, as I said earlier, it was interesting that Fox went, in a sense, as early as they did with this project around Family Guy. And what we've noticed is that they do now have this opportunity, and I think it's met with some success, where they're talking to their TV advertising, the guys that usually advertise on the show, and said, well, hey, for a little bit extra, you can have exposure through the game, right? And, that's met with some reasonably good success, I think. And so some of it is about that multiple screen experience, which I think is kind of what you're saying, that as the TV guys come in and, the idea of seeing Hawken on your PC when you're playing the game, the idea of it being, a web series or whatever it's going to turn out to be, potentially. I mean, another piece, is this whole idea of the second screen, which we don't have time to address now, but, the idea of taking that second screen app while you're watching a TV show and having that as kind of like, okay, you can, support material or, and I think, we'll see games as well where the main screen, you don't want to be interrupted with sponsorship, but the companion app brought to you by such and such, or, this whole idea of a proliferation of the same IP across multiple channels actually is pretty cool for content holders and, TV companies and the guys that own those kinds of materials because, as I said earlier, I think, the synergy between the brand and the content has more, more outlets, I suppose, given the number of screens, the number of, like, for example, the back cover of the Hawken comic, for example. That seems to be a really useful place where, for example, sponsorship could work, whereas, obviously in the middle of the game, you don't want to get flashed up with some, advert.
So it's actually about, it's a little bit after 2, and our discussion was going to go till 2. We might have time for maybe one more question, certainly. And then after that, I think we'll probably start to wrap it up. Go ahead.
Okay, I'm Morgan. I'm a college student at UW, and I don't know anything about free-to-play other than it fits my budget because I'm a broke college student, which made me think about the finances of free-to-play. It's a very, very different dynamic for an individual. They upfront purchase, and they've got the game, and then it's good to go. And now they get the game for free, and they can decide to buy microtransactions, et cetera, and that's where the money comes in. And I feel like, personally, at first, when I started using free-to-play, it was, oh, this is exciting, I'll spend a little bit of money. And then I realized that, I'm moving from game to game because they're all free, so what is the real incentive for me to spend any money in any game? I'm not going to be sitting there. So you guys worried that people are going to realize what free-to-play really is and they're going to stop spending as much money as they are now and just move on from free game to free game?
You may not be your prime customer.
No, actually you are. Data shows that 60% of core free-to-play gamers have some college education. I don't worry about it because it's free, we're reaching an order of magnitude greater number of players. If you think about it, the economics on a console title are a successful console game might sell 3 million units. The publisher will net out approximately $10 when it's all said and done of profit, so it's a $30 million net. Well, games like League of Legends make twice that a month currently, and they haven't even peaked yet in the world market. So I think you're probably right that you'll see more players playing for free, less players spending, but at the same time, the market will grow.
And I have one last comment on that, which is if you think about how many games in the sort of previous generation console, standalone PC, how many of them actually did make money, right? Everybody thinks, oh, there's sort of this 80% failure rate in free-to-play, and therefore it's not worth doing it. But, in a sense, the industry's always been hit-driven, right? So you get your World of Tanks and your League of Legends and, hopefully some of our games. And then at the same time, there is this industry where you can work on something for 3 years, the game gets canceled. So I don't see that piece has really changed, But nonetheless, if you make something that's compelling, if you make IP that people want to engage with on a long-term, ongoing basis, then I think that's the way that we're going to stop people just moving about from game to game. So really, it's a quality issue and an engagement issue, and obviously that's what we're working on every day, trying to improve the quality of both the content and then also just the mechanisms within the game, as I said earlier, that really help to retain users and keep them engaged and want to carry on playing.
So I think this has been a really great discussion, certainly one that I'm very interested in. I hope you guys have found it engaging. I want to thank you all for coming and spending some time with us. And I also want to specifically thank James and Mark for their valuable time and insights. So